the sexual revolution, and the human condition. This chart shows the fertility rate in Canada from 1926 to 2006. The fertility rate is the number of children a woman has if she lives through her full reproductive lifespan. In 1926, it was 3.4. It declined in the 1920s and early 30s, reaching about 2.6 before rising again to a peak in 1960 of almost 4. After that, it declined sharply, falling below 2 by 1972 and reaching 1.5 by the year 2000. It has since risen slightly to about 1.7. 2 is obviously the bare minimum required to replace a population. This chart shows the U.S. fertility rate from 1911 to 2011. It starts at 3.4, then begins a decline in the early 1920s and 30s, and reaches about 2.6 in the middle of the Great Depression, before rising again and cresting in 1960 at 3.6. Then, as in Canada, it goes through a very steep decline and reaches and falls below 2 in 1972, just as it did in Canada. But it rebounded slightly after that, went back above 2 in 1990, and has stayed around 2 ever since, although it is currently falling below 2 again. I should point out that although periods of low fertility coincided with economic downturns, such as the Great Depression and the 1970s energy crisis, which are shown on this chart, the economic downturns could not have caused the declines in fertility, because the declines in fertility significantly preceded the economic downturns. So it could be that the economic downturns and the fertility declines had a common cause, but the causation couldn't have gone in the direction from the economic situation to the fertility rate. This chart shows the fertility rates for selected countries comparing 1960 to 2010. I chose these countries to illustrate the global pattern of fertility decline. They can be divided into 2 groups: those which were in 1960 developing or underdeveloped, and those that were part of the modern developed world in 1960. The underdeveloped or developing countries include Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, India, Brazil, and China. And in 1960, they all had fertility rates of over 5. The developed countries include Russia, Germany, Japan, the United States, and Canada. In 1960, they all had rates of below 4, and Japan's was just at replacement levels. By 2010, almost all of the underdeveloped or developing countries had gone through very dramatic declines in fertility. The only exception on this chart is Nigeria, and Nigeria is representative of sub-Saharan Africa, where the sexual revolution had very little impact. But in other parts of the world, it had a major impact. In Saudi Arabia, the fertility rate declined from over 7 children per woman to under 3. In India, it declined from just under 6 to about 2.5. Brazil declined from over 6 to under 2. Currently, Brazil is below replacement. China declined significantly from over 5 children per woman to about 1.5. Now, part of that was due to the one-child policy, but a larger and more significant factor was the Cultural Revolution. So most of the fertility decline in China came before the one-child policy. Russia was, as a developed nation, a modern nation, had significantly lower fertility in 1960 at about 2.5 than the underdeveloped world, but its fertility still declined down to from 2.5 to about 1.5. most of that decline took place during the collapse of communism. Germany had fairly low fertility in 1960, and it's even lower today. It's tied with Japan at about 1.4. Japan is at 1.4, one of the lowest fertility countries in the world. The United States in 2010 was just over 2. It has since fallen slightly below 2. And Canada is at about 1.7 currently. So this illustrates the global pattern that most developing nations outside sub-Saharan Africa went through rapid declines in fertility. And it appears that the fertility declines are converging down to below replacement. That is becoming the new normal fertility rate for the developed world. So what happened in 1960? The simple answer is the birth control pill. It was adopted at that time in the United States as a form of contraception, and following that it spread to many other countries around the world. And obviously it had a major impact on fertility. But that is not the whole story. There was also a broader and more complex transformation of culture and society going on at that time, and one that had been going on for at least the entire 20th century, but really started to accelerate in 1960. This included the breakdown of traditional norms about sex, marriage, and family, increasing urbanization, people living in cities and dealing with strangers and being able to engage in more or less anonymous sexual interaction. Television and pop culture, this allowed new ideas to flow around the world from mind to mind very efficiently, and also this new medium allowed for new forms of advertising that made people feel less secure about their own lives, about their appearance, and so on. So that certainly had an impact on human behavior. There was a growing concern about overpopulation and the environment. People started to realize that the Industrial Revolution was not entirely positive, that it had negative consequences, and further, that it was out of control. And there was also the movement of women into the workforce. This took women out of the home and away from motherhood, so they were delaying childbearing and having fewer children. So altogether, there was a major reduction in the cultural values and social structures that had previously promoted reproduction. Instead of following a traditional pattern of human life, which was centered around the family, people were now being encouraged to adopt a new self-centered way of life that involved the pursuit of pleasure for its own sake. And so now we have to ask, what are the consequences of this dramatic transformation in culture and society? But before we can do that, we have to think about where we came from. So this is a very brief history of reproduction in 4 bullet points. So before the Industrial Revolution, humanity lived in a Malthusian world. Things were pretty much static or stable. There were very high fertility rates and very high death rates. Famine, disease, and war limited population growth and shaped biology and culture. So people were born into a world and died in the same world. Things didn't really change. There was very little progress in terms of science and technology, art, literature. All of those things were more or less static. And the population was more or less static. It would fluctuate from generation to generation. There were good years and bad years. But there would always be something that would come along when population got too high and wipe out half the people. So that kept population in check. Until the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution caused a huge decline in death rates and a very rapid growth in the human population as famine, disease, and even warfare were reduced. So, although we did have some very horrific wars in the 20th century, the actual scale of warfare has been reduced by the growth of modern states and a reduction in tribal warfare, which, even though it's not as horrific because it's not on the same scale as, say, the genocides that we saw in the 20th century, it's an ongoing, perpetual thing. It kills off a large number of people in every generation in in tribal societies. And so by the elimination of that, that was one major cause of population growth. But the more important ones were the reduction in famine and disease. Modern medicine, modern agriculture, and so on allowed us to outstrip, basically leave behind the former constraints on population growth, and thus population grew exponentially over about 200 years. Now the sexual revolution, in some sense, is a counterpart of the Industrial Revolution. Because while the Industrial Revolution lowered death rates, the sexual revolution is lowering birth rates. And it might seem like these two things will eventually come to some sort of stable point, that they will balance each other out. However, I'm going to argue in what follows that that's not the case. But regardless of that, even though we have gone through these two major revolutions, our biology and culture are still primarily adapted to the Malthusian condition. Biology and culture, especially the deeper forms of culture, evolve very slowly. And we have not had enough time, have not had enough generations to really develop new cultural adaptations to the conditions of life that we have created by unleashing the forces of science and technology. The modern human condition. Disabling your sexual organs is like putting a car up on blocks. The tires still spin, but they don't propel the car forward. Your desires don't exist to make you feel good. They exist to make you reproduce your genes. So your desires have evolved to make you move through life and ultimately reproduce your genes. But they don't do that by making you consciously want to reproduce your genes. They merely trigger certain responses to certain situations, which would, in a so-called natural environment, which is to say the environment that those desires evolved in, would have the consequence of reproducing your genes. So for example, why do people want sex but not children? Well, if people wanted children instead of sex, then they would kidnap children, or they would adopt children, or they would do something else rather than, getting pregnant and going through all the pains of labor and so on. So in other words, they would not reproduce if they wanted children. It's the desire for sex and the desire to love and attraction, right? It's all those things that bring people together, cause them to have sex, and then a baby is a natural consequence of that. Now, once you have a baby, when you hold it in your arms, you look into its eyes, you interact with it, this triggers a new mechanism, right? It makes you love that specific baby and want to care for it. But you don't have a desire. Most people don't have a desire for children in an abstract way. They don't want a child in an abstract way unless it's culturally been that idea has been implanted in them culturally. So this is why, one reason why when people can choose to have sex without children, they stop having children, or they have very few children. So the condition of the modern human, or the human in the modern world, is that your desires have been disconnected from their functions. At least if you take birth control, or if you're a man and you're in a relationship with a woman who's on birth control, you're still feeling all your natural desires, the ones that evolved to make you reproduce. But they no longer have their natural consequences. You feel the same emotions, the same feelings of lust and love and everything, but they don't take you anywhere. Essentially, you're just spinning your wheels. Adapt or get the fuck out. The meme of non-reproduction is like a new virus spreading through human populations. Humanity will develop resistance to it. The genes and culture of people who choose to reproduce will replace the genes and culture of those who do not. This means that the world will become more African and less European. It will become more conservative and less liberal, because conservatives tend to have larger families. It will become more religious and less secular, again because religions tend to promote families, and they are a stabilizing influence on memes. They help to stabilize traditional values and traditional behaviors. The world will also become more psychopathic and less socially responsible. There will be more deadbeat dads and welfare moms. The sexual revolution will not solve the problem of overpopulation. Overpopulation is a global problem, whereas choosing not to reproduce is an individual problem. You cannot solve a social problem at the individual level. The people who choose not to reproduce will simply be replaced by those who do choose to reproduce. And so, even though it might have a temporary effect of lowering population in some parts of the world, that effect will not be persistent, and it is not a stable effect because it is self-eliminating. Case study: Ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. The ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel provide an interesting example of a successful cultural adaptation to the modern world. This is the adaptation. They are strongly religious, close-minded, and they keep their children away from other cultural influences such as television and public schooling. They rely on the welfare state. Men usually do not work. They spend their time studying religion, and they are usually exempt from military service. So they rely on the rest of the population to support them and protect them. But in spite of this, they are extremely self-righteous. They feel that they are morally superior to the rest of the population, and they set themselves apart by their distinctive dress. So this gives them a group cohesion, and it makes it more difficult for someone within that group to leave because they have to go across this big cultural barrier, right? They have to figure out a way to get out of that world and get into the different world. And even something as simple as you don't have any clothes that you could wear that would not appear strange in the outside world kind of keeps you within this group and forces you to stay within that echo chamber. They are family-oriented. They tend to marry young, and they have lots of children. The fertility rate is roughly 6.5 children per woman. And this is it's made a little bit easier by the fact that the men can put a lot of energy into helping out with the children and especially training the children and raising them up within that culture, because they don't have to exert energy to provide for themselves. Their population doubles every 15 to 20 years. So within less than a generation, they double their population. So they started out as a very small segment of Israel's population, and they are now a very rapidly increasing segment. Israel was founded by secular Jews, influenced by socialism and nationalism. But it is trending away from that original founding population and becoming more religious and especially more ultra-Orthodox. So they're having a much larger influence on the nature of the Israeli experiment. What is the future of modernity? By modernity, I mean the system of ideas, institutions, and practices, including science, technology, capitalism, free speech, and the rule of law, that emerged in Western Europe after 1500 and have since transformed the world. The Industrial Revolution increased production and thus lowered death rates. The Sexual Revolution has decreased reproduction and lowered birth rates. The full impacts of these revolutions have yet to be seen. Modernity has dramatically changed the conditions of human life and the selective pressures on our biology and culture. New adaptations will arise in response to those pressures. Paradoxically, human desires are not adapted to the modern world that we have created to satisfy those desires. In its current form, modernity is not a stable long-term solution to the problem of human existence.